So in this video, I wanted to just share a few things with you about the discussion board assignment. I believe Elizabeth circulated to you guys the typed out assignment sheet, but I just wanted to give you the rationale for this. So I think we're all familiar with typical discussion boards. The problem with them when you're trying to create a class community is that the teacher develops several prompts and then everyone responds to the prompt. And if that's all you have students do, then it just simply feels like another writing assignment for them. It's not really a discussion, even though we call it a discussion board. Some of the ways that we work around this is then we require students to reply to people on the discussion board. What I discovered is that this is a bookkeeping nightmare to try to track what are the original discussion posts that you're grading the students for, and then how do you find those little replies? And yes, there's threads, but did the student reply, and how many times did they reply, and which ones didn't? And of course, the more students you have, the more confusing this gets. So what this discussion board assignment does that I developed is it creates just an easier way for you to keep track of that, while at the same time really forcing the students to engage with one another's ideas. So a couple ground rules I have about this for the students is that usually I have 2, maybe 3 students, depending on how large your class is, be the discussion leaders for each discussion board. And I set this up ahead of time at the very beginning of the semester so students know when they are discussion leader. Those students have to post ahead of time of everyone else. That's the one little tricky part about this. So you have to give enough time for the discussion leaders to be able to read the material and be able to post a little bit early. But again, they know about this due date ahead of time, so they'll know that that week they have to get their reading done maybe earlier in the week than is normal. And so then those discussion leaders will post. Often I'll have this 24 to 48 hours ahead of when everyone else needs to post. And then once they've posted, all of the other students in the class are not to respond to your prompts that you posted, but they are to respond to the material that are in the student leader's posts. I also require students to use the student leader's name when they respond. And so you can build in all other kinds of little requirements. You can say that the first paragraph of their response must be kind of a summary or a reaction to the student. But I do think using the student's name is really important, right? So to say, I was interested in Katie's response to prompt number 2, and I'm wondering if Katie thinks, right? So I did make using their names a requirement. And I did sort of in some way indicate that they need to respond directly to what's being said by the student leader and then add to it in some way. And of course, you probably want to give your students examples of what you mean by that, right? So they could disagree, they could agree, they could extend, right? All those skills that we teach them in writing papers and dealing with other scholarly voices, you're kind of getting them to practice that. So that's one great side effect. But also what happens here is you've created a community where students are actually talking back to one another. But you still only have to look at one thing per student, right? And there's a slightly different rubric for the leaders and the students who are responding. So it really cuts back on your work and the amount of did a student reply and trying to find the reply, right? So each student only has one thing that you have to grade, but they are still having that conversational mode. The other element of this that I found to be really helpful for the students and that does create a sense of community are those synthesis posts that I write. These do take time, but I think you get better at it when you do it. And if you create the notes as you are grading the post, then the notes sort of develop themselves, right? So as I'm grading a post, say I'm looking at Katie's post and I think, oh, Katie made a really good point about this. I'll add that to my synthesis notes. Again, I think it's really important to use the students' names. So I will say so-and-so, Joe made this great point. When Betty responded to Joe, she offered up this tidbit. I really liked the way that Alice drew our attention to this passage in the text. No one else had noticed that, and that was a really insightful moment, right? So use the students' names all the way through your synthesis notes, which again is easy to do while you're sitting down grading the discussion boards. Just start making your synthesis notes as you go. And then the other thing I'll do is I'll interject my own voice into those notes, right? So, hey, I really liked everyone's discussion about whether Lady Audley was a villain or a victim. You guys brought up some great points. One thing we didn't consider was this, right? So it's my way as a teacher to kind of come in and say, okay, we need a little bit more attention here. You can also sort of politely and respectfully maybe correct any misinformation that's out there. So again, the synthesis notes I think are an important part of this. Even if you did a normal discussion board without respondents, I would suggest doing this. It gives them a sense that you're involved in the conversation, also without having to reply within the discussion thread, because I've tried that before too, and again, I think it gets to be a more difficult to try and say like, oh, did I interject my voice here? Am I always responding to the same student? How should I track the discussion board as it's going, and when should I respond and when not, right? You don't worry about interjecting your voice until the discussion board is done and closed. You sit down and you grade the discussion threads, and then as you're grading it, you're making your synthesis notes. You proofread those, type them up. You can even say them in a video if you wanted to, and then post it to that same discussion board. And then that has worked really well, and I think cuts down again on the amount of sort of bookkeeping and figuring out when you should interject yourself in the community as well. So that's kind of the rationale and some of my tidbits for the discussion board responder and respondent activity.